What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this Saturday video, please make sure you hit that like button and let me know what you think of today's very interesting discussion in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, or you're living on a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another Sit Down video. Also, if you're on TikTok, make sure you check out the Sit Down now on TikTok. We cover past and present crime on a daily basis. A lot more great crime content if you want to sink your teeth into it. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are, as usual, going to get into another very interesting topic. And A Bronx Tale is regarded as one of the better mob movies of all time. We've all seen Goodfellas, Casino, and Donnie Brasco. We can throw A Bronx Tale into that grouping as well. One of the characters that we remember most from the film is Santino Sonny Lo Specchio. And yeah, I know you probably never knew his real name was Santino, but it is. Sonny is one of the most endearing mob characters of all time. And if you know anything about the film, most of it is the real life portrayal of Sonny, Chazz Palminteri's real life. The question we've always asked Palminteri that he's never answered is, who is the real life basis of Sonny? That we don't know if he'll ever tell us, but did I figure out who it was? Yeah, it might be a little vague, but let's break down who I think the real Sonny is. The story of Giovanni Ormento, aka Big John, next on the Sit Down. John Ormento was born on August 1st, 1912 in East Harlem. Now, obviously, this picture is quite old, but there's one thing we don't really remember about East Harlem today is that back in the 10s, 20s, and even into the 30s, it was the ground zero for Italians in New York. It wasn't Little Italy down in lower Manhattan. It wasn't the Bronx. It was East Harlem. And most of the mob, most notably the early Lucchese crime family, Genovese crime family, was based in East Harlem. The 107th Street mob, the different purple gangs and all the different groups, the 116th Street crew, all of it was based in East Harlem. Some of the most famous mobsters of all time came up in East Harlem, and one of them was John Ormento. Now, according to the 1940 census, in which John Ormento was around 27, 28 years old, he lived in the area of 217 East 107th Street in East Harlem. And we can venture to believe that he was part of the early onset 107th Street mob, which included people like Tommy Lucchese, who Ormento was close to, as well as people like Tom Mix Santura. Now, back then, the Lucchese crime family was the Reina crime family, and that was based out of the Bronx. So when we look into Reina, the early onset of the Lucchese family, the Reina crime family, eventually the Gagliano crime family, that was out of the Bronx, East Harlem. Now, when we look into John Ormento, his first brush with the law would happen in and around 1937. He would ultimately serve 3 years for narcotics. The biggest thing that we have to remember about John Ormento is he is arguably one of the biggest junk traffickers of all time. And he, alongside Carmine Galante, I don't know if you can get two bigger ones. Other, guys were there that we'll talk about, but these guys were a drug cartel before we had drug cartels. And we'll get into the connection to the Catroni crime family and how they would traffic heroin from Montreal into New York City. Now, John Ormento was particularly close with Tommy Lucchese. In fact, down the road when Lucchese would create what is the Reina and Gagliano crime family to the Lucchese family, once Ormento was made in the 40s, he would then become a captain under Tommy Lucchese, and he'd actually report directly to him. Now, according to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was essentially a faction underneath the FBI, they would assert that Mr. Ormento was part of a multi-family consortium that essentially moved narcotics that came in through Canada, through the Catroni crime family and their connections to people like Carmine Galante and Tony Mira. These guys would then furnish the drugs into New York and give them to black organized crime or to other dealers. They were the connect straight up. And John Ormento was one of the major violators of that. Now, by 1950, according to what we know about Mr. Ormento, he would actually live in the area of 5819 79th Street, according to the census. And at that time, according to that, he, quote, owned a manufacturing business, which we don't know much more around that. Now, I guess in term, he kind of did. I know John Ormento was involved in the garment district at one point. And that, again, if you look into his junk moving, he was manufacturing stuff. But that's what he told the census back in those times. Down the road, Ormento would move to the fashionable Lido Beach on Long Island. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. Now, some of John Ormento's closest cohorts, particularly in the narcotics business, was Carmine Galante, Vincent Squilanti, who was based out of the Bronx and a member of the Gambino crime family, as well as people like Tony Mira. Now, Tony Mira, a lot of people don't know, before his involvement with Donnie Brasco and that sort of thing, he was a major junk dealer, and he would be involved with Carmine Galante and kind of his point man in that. Also involved with Mr. Ormento was the very powerful drug supplier, Joe Beck di Palermo. And I've done a video and podcast on Joe Beck in the past, and he was a major junk dealer himself. Another cohort of Ormento would be Salvatore Tom Mix Santoro. And Santoro grew up in East Harlem. He was very close with all sorts of people, Genovese people, Bonanno people, and obviously his stablemate in the Lucchese crime family, Big John Ormento. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the way that Ormento and Galante moved narcotics. And these guys were really on the ground floor of, stuff like the French Connection. They had connections in Mexico. Some of the things down the road, including the Pleasant Avenue boys, a lot of that was the early onset of people like Tremonti, Carmine Tremonti, John Ormento. If you ever want to read a great book regarding the Pleasant Avenue connection, make sure you check out this book by David Dirk and Ira Silverman, a great book that should be in your collection. But I want to talk about Ormento's kind of involvement with not only the Catroni crime family and how they moved narcotics into America through Montreal. A lot of people don't really kind of know when it comes to geography, but New York City and Montreal aren't that far away from each other. Now you have to drive through a lot of barren wasteland in upstate New York between Albany and the border up in I believe the Adirondacks, I believe it is. But it's God's country, but there are very easy thoroughfares right from Montreal to New York City. And a lot of the connection that guys like Galante and Ormento had were through the Catroni crime family, most notably this individual who, when we look into who he is, he's a man called Giuseppe Catroni. Now, according to the federal government, Giuseppe Pepe Catroni handled the exportation of narcotics from Canada, and it would use couriers that brought the narcotics across the border and down through upstate New York into the New York metropolitan area. They would then be received by members of the conspiracy who manned drug centers in the New York metro area, where they received from drugs from couriers, diluted, and then packaged them. Distributors would finally dispose through various selling outlets. And according to the government, the individuals at the top of the New York distribution were the, quote, chief executives, Carmine Galante and John Ormento. Now, what is interesting about all of the junk being moved is that we have surveillance and witnesses that place Galante and Ormento touching narcotics, ferrying pickups for narcotics. It's not like these guys were just like up at the top and have people doing stuff for them. We have direct witnesses that worked with these guys on a regular basis. One of the people that the federal government would connect with, and he would become a government witness, is a person called Edward Smith. Now, Edward Smith had underworld connections in Canada, and would meet various people in New York. And those guys would make runs, they were called, to take the narcotics from Montreal to New York. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about Catroni, and I want to talk about Edward Smith. In one instance, Edward Smith would meet Carmine Galante alongside several other defendants, including Vic Catroni, Frank Catroni, and Giuseppe Catroni, and also a person identified as, quote, Angelo. Now, from what I understand, I believe Angelo is Angelo Loiacono. Now, if you know anything about Angelo Loiacono, he was a chief confidant and soldier in Big John Ormento's crew. So understand, that's where it goes back to him. Now, when Edward Smith, who was a witness, would meet up with these guys, he would claim that Galante picked up some sort of vial and put it on the coffee table. He would then open it. Another individual would examine its contents, which were clear plastic bags containing a, quote, white powder. As Edward Smith and a defendant called Mancino were leaving with the vials, they encountered several defendants, including Pep Catroni and someone else called Vecchio. At that point, Smith and Mancino drove to New York to Frank's Bar and Grill in Brooklyn, where Mancino took the narcotics and Smith returned to Montreal. They would then, just as I said, meet Angelo Loiacono. And he was Ormento's soldier and identified as someone called Puggy. That was Loiacono's nickname. In Loiacono's presence, a person called Rocco Sansanella. Now, Rocco Sansanella was said to be a pickup man. He was a guy who worked in doing stuff for Puggy Loiacono. Sansanella asked Edward Smith to make runs from Canada for them. When Smith declined this offer, Loiacono told him, quote, he could make $100,000 to $140,000 a year in this work, and that Smith should, quote, think it over. So again, they're going to pay this guy to ferry narcotics from Montreal into Canada. Now remember, this is in the late 50s. $100,000 is millions of dollars today. So just think of how much money people like Mr. Ormento is making in doing business with Catroni and others. Now, also, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the other people involved in this drug conspiracy. They would include none other than Anthony Mira. Now, in late June of 1958, Mira, Edward Smith, and a person called Joseph Curtis drove to the vicinity of 56th Street and Sutton Place in Manhattan, where Carmine Galante was standing on a corner. They would approach, and Galante would tell Mira that the, quote, stuff was in a nearby car. Mira and Edward Smith, the Canadian, removed a suitcase from the rear of the car, and Mira gave it to Curtis, who then put it in his car. Galante would ask Mira if he knew what to do, and Mira indicated that he, quote, did, and Galante gave Smith 10 $100 bills. Mira, Smith, and Curtis then drove to the Park Sheraton Hotel, where Smith and Mira went upstairs. In one of the rooms, guess who they would meet? John Ormento and a person called Vinnie Bruno, who is not a defendant in this case. Mira would take the suitcase, throw it on the bed, and Ormento would open it, revealing a number of cellophane bags with white powder. And we are talking about pounds and pounds of H, right? So we're seeing these guys directly handling this stuff. This was not in the hands of Ormento's people or a runner. This was Ormento and Galante doing these themselves. Now, this is way before Galante is the boss of the Bonanno crime family. This is 16, 17 years before. That said, these are some of the most powerful gangsters in New York in respected families. This is how the mob controlled narcotics. They were the plug, no one else. It isn't like now where you have large transnational drug cartels doing this stuff. The connects were the Italians at that point. You look into people like Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson was getting his junk before like the Frank Matthews of the worlds from the Italians. this is how it worked back then. Now, Galante and Ormento were again dealing with it themselves. And on the 28th or 29th of June in 1958, we also hear more about Ormento and Carmine Galante and Anthony Mira. Mira, alongside Edward Smith, were then arrested by local authorities. Upon their release, Ed Smith was criticized by Mira for not, quote, changing hotels. And when Smith remained adamant, Mira told him to make a change or we'd wind up behind a truck. Because if, quote, Carmine gives the order, John, quote, Ormento, will have to carry it out, and you're going to wind up being dragged behind a truck. So Mira is insinuating to Edward Smith that they can't keep screwing up, and the fact that they were arrested is going to raise major bells and down the road get them whacked. So this also, again, goes back to the old notion of the government's favorite word, conspiracy. Wasn't really a conspiracy, though, because these people were on record handling narcotics, giving orders to people like Angelo Loiacono and Rocco Sansanella, who were cohorts of, guess who? John Ormento. Now, I'm sure you're probably thinking, what does this have to do with the Bronx Tale? Well, there are some things that make me want to believe that the real Sonny character is John Ormento. Now, we've heard all sorts of stories over the years that Palminteri may have taken the story from someone else, or it was someone from the Genovese crime family. But there's a couple of things about Chazz Palminteri that make me think that this may actually be John Ormento. Now, Chazz Palminteri was born May 15th, 1952, and he would grow up in an area of the Bronx, Belmont Avenue. It's near Arthur Avenue, 180-ish type streets, that area. I believe Palminteri was from East 187th Street, approximately. Don't quote me on that. But when we look into Ormento, it was said that John Ormento regularly was working in and around the Bronx, knew a lot of people in the Bronx. It's a stone's throw away from East Harlem. It's also been said that Ormento maintained a bar on Belmont Avenue. We also look into Palminteri. Born in 1952, in the film A Bronx Tale, he was approximately 8 to 10 years old, right? 8 years old is around 1960. Ormento's still on the street at that time. He's operating in that area. He may have many connections to the Bronx. We know that for many years, he was friends with people like Vincent Squilanti. He knew, obviously, plenty of people from the Bronx in the Lucchese family. East Harlem's very close. It is very possible that when Palminteri is growing up, he sees Ormento. Now, why he won't tell us, I don't know. He's insinuated that it was a certain figure. It could be anybody. It's really just a thought. That said, when we look at these two people, like they are two quite formidable individuals. I wouldn't say they look alike, but the ages work out, the power work out. Now, it's a little different because Sonny was kind of the man in that area. I'm not sure that he was in terms of Ormento. That said, there are some connections. Obviously, the bar, he had business interests in that neighborhood. We'll likely never know who the real Sonny is. If I ever talk to Palminteri, I would like to ask him if he'd ever heard of Ormento. I don't know why he wouldn't discuss Ormento. I mean, Ormento has been dead for 60 plus years. I do though want to come into one pretty interesting story that other creators have talked about, and it's not Mr. Ormento's run-ins with Chazz Palminteri. It's actually Ormento had a very interesting run-in with Billy Crystal, of all people, who has appeared in, mob films like Analyze, I believe, he was in other films, City Slickers, When Harry Met Sally. He's talked about in a book he wrote that when he was a child, he lived in Lido Beach, which is in Long Island, and that's where John Ormento lived. And in the 50s, he and his family were eating dinner at a Chinese restaurant. His family had just purchased a new vehicle, and someone hit his car, his father's car, and it was John Ormento drunk. John Ormento fled the scene, and days later went to Billy Crystal's home. Billy Crystal was near like 10 years old. He opens the door and it's John Ormento. John Ormento would walk in and state to his father that he'd like to buy him a new car as long as he doesn't report anything to police, because Billy Crystal's father declined, even though he likely knew it was John Ormento. He didn't tell the police. John Ormento offers to buy him any car he wants, and Billy Crystal states that his father declined a new car and just said, "Can you fix the car we have?" To which Ormento was kind of upset that he didn't take him up on his offer. Yet 2 weeks later, the car came back and it looked like it did before. So what's interesting is, in a weird way, like, not only did Billy Crystal possibly have a run-in, well, he did have a run-in with Ormento, but Palminteri may have as well, in a weird way. And it involved the car and, kind of an interesting story. I know OC Shorts did a video, I believe, on that at some point. It was a pretty good video. And if you want to hear more about that, you can check it out. But in terms of John Ormento, his life would change considerably once he was indicted in the whole case in the early 60s. In fact, down the road in this over $1 million operation in the early 60s involving moving junk with the Catroni crime family, not only would Ormento be indicted, but his number two, essentially, Angelo Loiacono, Carmine Galanti, all sorts of people involved in this conspiracy would be indicted. Now, one other interesting name in the indictment was this guy, the real William Benvena, who is made famous from Goodfellas. Now, it isn't him. It was obviously Frank Vincent playing him. But when Benvena comes home from prison in the early 70s, his sentence had to do with this operation. And Benvena was from Valley Stream, Long Island. So did he and Ormento know each other? We don't know. Sometimes people in indictments know each other and sometimes they don't. In the end, John Ormento got one of the longest sentences in this case. He would be hit with 40 years in prison. And at one point, the judge would call him, quote, an incurable cancer on society. When we look back at John Ormento, I don't know that we can talk about how big of a narcotics trafficker he was. He was on the forefront of moving narcotics in the 50s and into the 60s. And don't let them tell you the mafia never got involved with drugs. That is so far from the truth. And when we look back on people like Ormento, when we look back on people like Carmine Galanti, when we look back on people like Joe Beck, Anthony Mira, all of these guys were major narcotics traffickers. John Ormento would die in March of 1974. He was 61 years old, and he would die in prison after serving a little over 12 years. Is he the real life Sonny from A Bronx Tale? I don't know. I have some reasons to believe he might be, but the truth is, we'll likely never know who Sonny Lo Specchio actually was. And yeah, maybe I taught you that his name was Lo Specchio. I bet you didn't know that in the film. If you'd like to support our channel further, please make sure you hit that like button. And if you'd like to go one step past that, hit that super thanks icon underneath the video. And make sure you let me know what you think in the comments below. We'll see you next week here on the Sit